The Galactic Council's research station hung in the darkness of space like a massive metal city. Inside its corridors walked creatures from hundreds of different worlds. There were beings made of living crystal, others that floated like jellyfish, and some that looked almost human but weren't. Among all these strange aliens, the Drafka stood out. They were dragons, real, actual dragons, but not the fairy tale kind. These were ancient, intelligent beings whose scales shimmered with colors that didn't exist on Earth. Their eyes held the wisdom of civilizations that rose and fell before humans even discovered fire. The Drafka kept to themselves mostly, living in a special section of the station where the ceilings were high enough for their massive wings. They were respected. Feared, even. When Ambassador Kellen's mate laid 3 eggs in the station's observation dome, it became the biggest news in months. Dragon births were incredibly rare. Some species went their entire lives without seeing one. Jake Morrison didn't care much about any of that. He was too busy trying to get a stubborn stain out of the floor in Sector 7. Jake was 51 years old, with gray creeping into his brown hair and permanent dark circles under his eyes from years of night shifts. He'd come to the station 6 years ago after his divorce, looking for a fresh start. Turns out, toilets need cleaning everywhere in the galaxy, not just on Earth. He worked when everyone else slept, moving through empty hallways with his cleaning cart, listening to old country music on his headphones. Sometimes he'd stop at the big viewing windows and stare out at the stars, wondering how his life had ended up here. But he didn't mind the solitude. After the chaos of his marriage falling apart, the quiet felt like a gift. The night the eggs hatched, Jake was working near the Drafka sector. He could hear the commotion even through the thick walls, roaring, singing, the sound of celebration. The first egg cracked open around midnight. Then the second. Both hatchlings emerged perfect, one gleaming red like a ruby, the other gold like sunshine. The Drafka elders sang songs of praise that made the station's metal walls hum. Jake kept working. Not his business. But around 3 in the morning, he heard something different. Not celebration. Angry voices, harsh and cold. He paused his music and listened. The third egg had finally hatched, hours after the others. Through the ventilation system, he heard words in the Drafka language. He'd picked up enough to understand the gist: disappointment, shame, defective. An hour later, Jake was cleaning near the waste disposal area in the lower decks. This was the ugliest part of the station, where garbage got compressed and ejected into space, where broken equipment went to die. The lighting was bad, the smell worse. Nobody came down here except Jake in the maintenance bots. That's when he heard it. A soft sound, almost like a kitten crying. But wetter. More desperate. Jake followed the sound to one of the large disposal containers. Inside, barely visible among the trash, was something small and gray. At first, he thought it was some kind of rat. Then it moved, and he saw the wings. Tiny, bent wings. A tail. A small reptilian head with eyes that glowed like amber. A dragon. A baby dragon, no bigger than a football, shivering and making that awful crying sound. Jake's first instinct was to walk away. This wasn't his problem. The Drafka had obviously put it here on purpose. Getting involved could cost him his job, maybe get him kicked off the station entirely. He had enough problems without adding interspecies drama. But those eyes. The hatchling looked right at him, and Jake saw something he recognized. The look of something thrown away. Something nobody wanted. He thought about his own daughter, Melissa, back on Earth. How she'd stopped returning his calls after the divorce. How his ex-wife had told her he was a failure, and Melissa had believed it. How it felt to be discarded by the people who were supposed to love you. Damn it, Jake muttered. He looked around. The security cameras in this sector had been broken for weeks, nobody bothered fixing them this far down. The maintenance bots were charging in their docking stations. Nobody was watching. Jake pulled off his work jacket and carefully lifted the hatchling out of the trash. The little dragon was ice cold, barely breathing. Its scales felt rough and dull, not smooth and shiny like the dragons he'd seen on the upper decks. One wing was bent at an odd angle. It was so small, so fragile. He wrapped it in his jacket and held it against his chest, letting his body heat warm it. The crying stopped. The hatchling burrowed into the fabric, seeking warmth and safety. "Okay," Jake whispered. "Okay. Let's get you somewhere warm." He tucked the bundle inside his shirt and pushed his cleaning cart back toward the service elevators. His heart hammered. This was insane. He was smuggling a dragon. An actual dragon. If anyone caught him, he was done. But as the elevator descended toward the maintenance worker quarters in the deepest part of the station, Jake felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Like maybe, just maybe, he was doing something that mattered. Jake's quarters were basically a closet with a bed. 8 feet by 10 feet, with a narrow bunk, a tiny desk, and a bathroom so small he had to sit sideways on the toilet. The walls were bare metal, painted that depressing shade of gray that somehow existed on every space station in the galaxy. But it was private, and right now, that's all that mattered. He laid the hatchling on his bed and grabbed every blanket he owned. The little dragon was still cold, its breathing shallow and quick. Jake cranked up the heating unit until sweat started dripping down his back, then wrapped the creature in layers of thermal blankets usually reserved for emergency situations. "Come on, buddy," he muttered, rubbing the blankets gently. "Don't die on me now." The hatchling's eyes cracked open, those strange amber eyes that seemed far too aware for something just born. It made a small chirping sound, weak but alive. Jake felt his shoulders sag with relief. But now what? He couldn't keep a dragon in his room forever. And it would need food. Water. He didn't know the first thing about taking care of a dragon. Jake spent the next 3 hours hunched over his desk terminal, searching through the station's database. Most information about Draftka biology was restricted, but he found some basic care guides written for xenobiology students. Dragons were carnivores, needed high-protein food every few hours as hatchlings. They required specific minerals for scale development. Their body temperature ran hot, hence all the blankets. He named the dragon Ember. It seemed fitting for something gray as ash but still holding a spark of life. The first week was terrifying. Jake worked his shifts in a fog of exhaustion, terrified someone would search his room while he was gone. He'd fashioned a nest inside his locker from heating pads and towels, and Ember stayed there during work hours, quiet as death. The dragon seemed to understand they needed to hide. Jake stole food from the cafeteria, bits of protein paste, synthetic meat, anything he could pocket without being noticed. He mashed it up and fed Ember with his fingers. The hatchling ate like it was starving, which it probably was. By the second week, Ember had doubled in size. Now he was as big as a house cat, his tail long enough to wrap around Jake's arm. The gray scales were still dull, but they'd taken on a slightly metallic sheen. The bent wings still looked wrong, but Ember didn't seem to be in pain. Jake started talking to him during the long night shifts. At first, it felt stupid, talking to an animal. But Ember listened, his head cocked to one side, those amber eyes focused completely on Jake's face. "My daughter, Melissa, she used to love dragons," Jake said one night, sitting on his bunk while Ember curled in his lap. "Had all these books about them. Fantasy stuff, you know? Knights and princesses. She'd make me read them every night before bed." He scratched under Ember's chin, and the dragon made a purring sound. "Haven't talked to her in 3 years. She thinks I'm a loser. Maybe she's right." Ember chirped and pressed his head against Jake's chest. "Yeah, you're probably just hungry," Jake laughed, but his eyes were wet. The third week, Ember started trying to fly. Jake came back from his shift to find his room trashed, blankets scattered, his desk lamp knocked over, claw marks on the walls. Ember sat in the middle of the chaos, looking embarrassed. "What happened here, buddy?" Ember spread his wings, one straight, one crooked, and flapped them hard. He lifted about 6 inches off the ground before crashing into the bed. Jake's heart broke a little. "Your wings messed up, huh?" "Yeah, I know that's not fair." But Ember didn't give up. Every day, Jake would come home to find new destruction and one very determined dragon practicing his flying. Crash after crash after crash. The little guy never quit. Jake couldn't stand watching him struggle. He spent his one day off building a harness from spare equipment straps and padding. It wrapped around Ember's chest and under his wings, helping him balance. Together, they snuck into the empty cargo bays during night shifts, and Jake helped Ember learn to fly despite his deformity. It took 2 months, but Ember finally managed it. Wobbly, awkward, definitely not graceful, but flying. Jake whooped so loud he had to slap his hand over his mouth, terrified someone would hear. Ember flew a victory lap around the cargo bay, scales catching the dim emergency lights, and Jake felt prouder than he'd felt about anything in years. They became a team after that. Jake and Ember against the universe. The dragon grew smarter every day, understanding commands, responding to his name, even learning to open doors with his claws. He was loyal in a way that made Jake's chest tight, following him everywhere, sleeping curled against his side, always watching the door when Jake left, waiting for him to come home. "You're a good boy," Jake would whisper, scratching behind Ember's horns. "I don't care what those other dragons said. You're perfect." But the peace couldn't last forever. It was Lisa Chen who found them. She was a junior security officer, young and sharp-eyed, doing random inspections of the maintenance quarters. Jake had helped her once, months ago, when her son got sick and she needed someone to cover her shift. He'd hoped that would count for something. She stood in his doorway, staring at Ember, who was now the size of a large dog. Her hand drifted toward her comm device. Jake's world stopped. "Lisa, please." "How long?" she asked quietly. 3 months. She looked at Ember, then at Jake. "My little brother was born with cerebral palsy. Couldn't walk right, couldn't talk clear. My parents wanted to institutionalize him. Said it would be easier." Her jaw tightened. "He's a professor now. Teaches math at MIT. Jake held his breath. "The Drafka have been scanning the station for biosignatures," Lisa said. "They know the hatchling's still alive. They're going sector by sector." She met Jake's eyes. "You've got 2 days. Maybe 3. After she left, Jake sat on the floor with Ember's head in his lap, wondering what the hell he was going to do. Running meant losing everything, his job, his home, probably getting banned from council space. Staying meant watching them kill Ember. He looked down at those amber eyes, full of trust. "Guess we're doing this the hard way," Jake said. Jake had 48 hours to figure out how to save Ember's life. He spent the first 12 making calls to every shady contact he'd made in 6 years on the station. There was Tommy Rodriguez, a cargo hauler who sometimes moved things without asking questions. Beth Kowalski, who worked in docking control and owed Jake a favor. Even tried reaching out to a Talaxian smuggler named Vrix who frequented the lower deck bars. Nobody wanted to touch it. Smuggling contraband was one thing. Stealing a Drafka hatchling? That was suicide. The dragons had influence everywhere, connections to half the major powers in the galaxy. Cross them, and you'd never dock at a civilized port again. "Sorry, Jake," Tommy said over the comm, and he actually sounded sorry. "I got kids. I can't risk it." Jake didn't blame them. He was asking too much. Plan B was sneaking Ember onto a cargo ship himself, but station security had locked down the docking bays. Ships were being searched before departure. The Drafka weren't taking chances. Ambassador Kellen had made an official announcement. The defective specimen needed to be humanely disposed of for the dignity of the bloodline. He'd filed a formal request with the council, and they'd approved it. Just like that. A living creature sentenced to death because it didn't look right. Jake held Ember close that night, the dragon's warm body pressed against his chest. Ember had grown so much in 3 months. His head now reached Jake's shoulder when he Saturday. His scales, though still gray, had a strange beauty to them, like gunmetal, like storm clouds. His crooked wing had gotten stronger with practice. He could fly now, not gracefully, but he could do it. "I'm not letting them take you," Jake whispered into Ember's scales. "I don't know how, but I'm not." Ember made a low rumbling sound, almost like a cat's purr but deeper. He trusted Jake completely. That trust felt like a weight on Jake's chest, crushing and precious at the same time. On the second day, Jake's luck ran out. He was trying to move Ember through the maintenance tunnels to a temporary hiding spot in the waste processing sector. It was 3 in the morning, the station at its quietest. They'd almost made it when Jake turned a corner and froze. 3 Drafka warriors stood in the corridor ahead. They were smaller than Kellen but still massive, 8 feet tall, scales gleaming red and bronze, their eyes like molten gold. They'd been searching the lower decks systematically, and Jake had walked right into them. "The human has the defective one of them said in their rumbling language. "Seize it." Ember, pressed against Jake's leg, suddenly planted himself in front of the janitor. The little gray dragon spread his wings as wide as they'd go, which wasn't very wide, and let out what was probably supposed to be a threatening roar. It came out more like a loud squeak. Under different circumstances, it might have been funny. A dragon the size of a large dog trying to intimidate warriors who could snap him in half. "Ember, no," Jake started. But the warriors were already advancing. One reached for Ember, and the dragon snapped at his claws. Jake did the only thing he could think of, he stepped in front of Ember. "Back off," Jake said, his voice shaking but loud. "You're not touching him." The warriors stopped, more surprised than threatened. One of them actually laughed. "Human, move aside. This does not concern you." "Like hell it doesn't. He's mine. I raised him. You threw him away, and I took him in. That makes him mine." "You understand nothing," another warrior growled. "That creature is an insult to our bloodline. Its existence shames us." "Your shame is your problem," Jake shot back. His legs were trembling, but he stood his ground. He's just a kid. He didn't do anything wrong except be born different. A crowd was gathering now. Jake's shouting had woken people up, and aliens from a dozen species were emerging from their quarters, filling the corridor. He could see Lisa in the crowd, her hand on her weapon but not drawing it. Others he recognized from his cleaning rounds, Dr. Patel from Xenobiology, Marcus the cook, even a couple of Talaxian traders. The warriors noticed the crowd too. One of them activated his comm. We have located the defective. Requesting Ambassador Kellen's presence. 10 minutes later, the crowd had tripled in size. Word was spreading through the station like wildfire. And then Kellen arrived. The ambassador was enormous, twice the size of his warriors. His scales were deep crimson with veins of black, and they glowed faintly within a fire. His wings, folded against his back, were scarred from battles Jake couldn't imagine. When he walked, the metal floor groaned under his weight. Kellen's eyes fixed on Ember, and something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe. Or regret. It was gone in an instant, replaced by cold authority. Step aside, Jake Morrison, Kellen's voice rumbled through the corridor like thunder. This ends now. No. Jake's voice cracked, but he didn't move. Ember pressed harder against his legs, trembling but not running. You do not understand what you are protecting. That creature is defective. Weak. Its continued existence is an affront to everything the Drathka represent. I understand plenty, Jake said, and suddenly he wasn't scared anymore. He was angry. Furious. I understand you threw your own kid in the trash because he wasn't perfect. I understand you were gonna let him freeze to death in a garbage container. And I understand that says a lot more about you than it does about him. The crowd murmured. Kellen's eyes narrowed dangerously. But Jake wasn't done. Words were pouring out now, years of pain and anger finding a target. You know what humans did, back in the old days? We did the same thing. Babies born different, born disabled, we called them defective too. Left them to die. Locked them away. Acted like they were shameful mistakes. His voice broke. It was the ugliest, most evil thing we ever did. And we're still trying to make up for it. Still trying to fix that mistake. Jake looked down at Ember, then back at Kellen. This dragon, he's got more heart than any of you. I've watched him crash 100 times learning to fly with that messed up wing, and he never quit. Not once. You call him weak? He's the strongest thing I've ever seen. The silence in the corridor was absolute. Even the Drathka warriors looked uncomfortable. Then Ember did something impossible. He opened his mouth, and he sang. The sound that came out was broken, raspy, nothing like the beautiful songs the other Drathka made. But it carried harmonics that made the walls vibrate, that resonated in Jake's chest like a second heartbeat. It was raw and imperfect and absolutely, heartbreakingly beautiful. Every Drathka in the corridor dropped to their knees. Kellen's eyes went wide with shock. Dragon song, he whispered. Impossible. The song lasted only a few seconds before Ember's voice gave out. But those few seconds changed everything. The silence after Ember's song was deafening. Jake stood there, not understanding what had just happened, but knowing it was significant. The Drathka warriors were still on their knees, their heads bowed. Kellen looked like someone had punched him in the gut, his massive form rigid with shock. What does it mean? Jake asked quietly, his hand resting protectively on Ember's head. An elderly Drathka female pushed through the crowd. Her scales were pale gold, faded with age, and her eyes were milky white. She moved slowly but with purpose, leaning on a staff. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of centuries. Dragon song is the rarest gift of our people, she said. Only 1 in 1,000 possesses it. It is the voice of the soul itself, the purest expression of a Drathka's inner fire. She looked at Ember with something like wonder. I have lived 600 years and heard it only twice before. But he's supposed to be defective, one of the warriors said weakly. Defective. The old female's laugh was sharp as broken glass. You fools. You threw away a singer. Within an hour, the corridor had become a circus. Scientists arrived with scanning equipment. Dr. Rachel Foster, the station's head xenobiologist, nearly knocked Jake over in her excitement to examine Ember. The little dragon, overwhelmed by all the attention, tried to hide behind Jake's legs. Easy, easy, Jake said, kneeling beside Ember. Nobody's gonna hurt you, buddy. I promise. Rachel waited patiently until Ember calmed down enough to allow a basic scan. She was a woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and hands that moved gently over Ember's scales. Jake stayed close, ready to intervene if needed. What they discovered over the next few hours changed everything. Rachel stood before the assembled crowd, her datapad glowing with results. Kellen watched from the back, his expression unreadable. Jake sat on the floor with Ember curled in his lap, the dragon exhausted from all the tests. Ember isn't defective, Rachel began. His evolved. His grayscales? They absorb electromagnetic radiation instead of reflecting it. That makes him nearly invisible to most sensor technology. We literally couldn't track him on our scans until we knew what to look for. She pulled up a holographic display showing Ember's wing structure. His wings are shaped differently, yes. But look at the musculature here, and here. This configuration gives him incredible maneuverability in tight spaces. Traditional Draftka wings are built for open sky, for power and distance. Ember's wings are built for precision flying in enclosed environments. A Talaxian scientist stepped forward, adding his own findings. His bone density is lower, making him lighter. His metabolic rate is more efficient, requiring less food. And his neurological development is accelerated compared to standard Draftka hatchlings. In human terms, he's showing problem-solving abilities equivalent to a much older dragon. Dr. Foster continued, her voice growing more excited. The Draftka evolved on a planet with wide-open spaces. You became apex predators through size, strength, and fire. But look around you. She gestured at the metal walls of the station. The galaxy doesn't have endless skies anymore. It has space stations, starships, colonies built inside asteroids. Enclosed spaces where size is a disadvantage. She looked directly at Kellen. Ember isn't a mistake. He's an adaptation. He's what the Draftka might need to become to thrive in the modern galaxy. The murmuring in the crowd grew louder. Jake watched Kellen's face, trying to read the ambassador's reaction. The big dragon's expression cycled through emotions: disbelief, anger, confusion, and finally something that might have been shame. How many? Kellen asked quietly. I'm sorry? Rachel said. How many others like him? Kellen's voice was rough. How many hatchlings have we discarded over the centuries because they didn't fit our ideal? How many singers have we thrown away? The old female Draftka spoke up. I know of at least 3 in my lifetime. Perhaps dozens over our history. Perhaps hundreds. The weight of that statement settled over the corridor like a physical thing. Jake felt sick thinking about it. Hundreds of baby dragons, left to die because they were different. How many had there been with no janitor around to save them? Kellen finally stepped forward, moving through the crowd until he stood directly in front of Jake and Ember. The ambassador was so large that Jake had to crane his neck to look up at him. Ember, sensing danger, growled softly. The hatchling will return to the clan, Kellen announced. We will raise him as Draftka, teach him our ways. No, Jake said. The crowd gasped. You didn't interrupt a Draftka ambassador. You definitely didn't tell one no. But Jake stood up, gently moving Ember behind him. You don't get to do that. You threw him away. You left him to die. You don't get to just take him back now that you know he's valuable. He is my son. Biologically, maybe, Jake shot back. But I'm the one who fed him. Kept him warm. Taught him to fly. Sat up with him when he had nightmares. You were his father for maybe an hour. I've been his father for 3 months. Kellen's scales flared with heat, glowing brighter. You cannot keep him. You are human. You cannot teach him what it means to be Draftka. And you can? You, who decided he wasn't worth keeping. Jake's voice rose. He doesn't need to learn how to be the kind of Draftka who throws away their kids. He needs to learn to be better than that. The two stared at each other, a 51-year-old janitor and a dragon ambassador who could kill him with one swipe. Jake's heart hammered in his chest, but he didn't back down. Couldn't back down. Not for Ember. Behind him, Ember made a decision of his own. The little dragon stepped around Jake's legs and sat down between them, facing Kellen. He spread his wings, one straight, one crooked, and sang again. This time, the song was different. Still raspy, still imperfect, but the melody was clear. It was a song of two halves, one part sorrow, ancient and deep, the other part joy, new and fragile. Jake didn't understand the meaning, but he felt it in his bones. Ember was singing about loss and finding, about being unwanted and then loved. Kellen listened, and something in the ambassador's expression cracked. His shoulders sagged. His glowing scales dimmed. For the first time since Jake had known him, Kellen looked old. I failed him, Kellen said quietly. I looked at my son and saw only what was wrong, not what was right. He met Jake's eyes. You saw what I could not. Jake didn't know what to say to that. Part of him wanted to feel victorious, but mostly he just felt tired. I cannot undo what I did, Kellen continued. But perhaps I can make an offer. He paused, choosing his words carefully. If you will not surrender the hatchling, and if the hatchling will not leave you, then there is only one solution. You must become Draftka. Jake blinked. What? Join my clan. Learn our ways. Raise Ember as one of us. You will have all the rights and responsibilities of clan membership. And Ember will have his heritage, taught by one who actually values him. The crowd erupted in shocked conversation. Jake stood there, completely blindsided. Become a dragon? That was insane. But Ember pressed against his leg, looking up at him with those amber eyes full of trust and hope. Jake thought about his tiny quarters, his lonely night shifts, the daughter who wouldn't speak to him. Then he looked at Ember, who'd brought purpose back to his empty life. Okay, Jake heard himself say. Okay. I'll do it. The ceremony happened 3 days later in the station's largest observation dome. Jake had never seen it so packed. Every Draftka on the station attended, along with representatives from dozens of other species. Even the council sent observers. Apparently, a human being adopted into a dragon clan was newsworthy enough to attract attention from across the sector. Jake stood in the center of the dome wearing ceremonial robes that felt ridiculous on him. They were too big, designed for Draftka proportions, and the fabric kept sliding off his shoulders. Ember sat beside him, freshly groomed, his gray scales polished until they gleamed like steel. The little dragon kept looking up at Jake nervously, picking up on his anxiety. It's okay, buddy, Jake whispered. We got this. The old female Draftka, who Jake had learned was named Valora and served as the clan's elder, led the ceremony. Her voice carried through the dome without amplification, ancient words in a language that predated human civilization. Jake had spent the last 3 days learning basic phrases, but most of it still sounded like beautiful nonsense to his ears. Kellen stood across from them, looking more uncomfortable than Jake had ever seen him. The ambassador wore full ceremonial armor, his scales painted with ancestral symbols. Behind him stood his 2 perfect hatchlings, the red and gold dragons that everyone had celebrated. They watched Ember with newfound curiosity rather than disdain. Valora placed a clawed hand on Jake's shoulder. Jake Morrison, you have proven yourself worthy through action. You saw value where others saw waste. You showed courage where others showed fear. You chose love where others chose tradition. She paused, her milky eyes somehow still seeing deep into him. Do you swear to honor the ways of Clan Kellen, to protect its members, to carry its name with dignity? Jake's mouth was dry. I do. Do you swear to raise this hatchling as Draftka, to teach him strength and wisdom, to help him find his place among the stars? Jake looked down at Ember, who chirped softly. Yeah. I swear. Valora turned to Kellen. And you, Kellen of the ancient blood, do you accept this human into your clan? Do you recognize his bond with your son? Do you pledge to teach him as you would teach your own? Kellen hesitated. Jake could see the war happening behind those golden eyes, pride fighting with something else. Finally, the ambassador spoke. I do. And I pledge more. I will learn from him as well. He has taught me that strength comes in forms I did not recognize. That a father's true test is not in producing perfect offspring, but in loving the ones he has. The crowd murmured with approval. Valora nodded, satisfied. She produced a small crystal blade and made a shallow cut on Jake's palm, then did the same to Kellen's. Their blood, red and dark gold, dripped into a ceremonial bowl. Then she pricked Ember's foot, adding the hatchling's silver-colored blood to the mix. Blood shared is bond made, Valora intoned. From this day, Jake Morrison, you are clan. You are Draftka in spirit if not in form. You are father, brother, protector. She marked Jake's forehead with the mixed blood, tracing a symbol he'd been told meant new fire. The blood tingled where it touched his skin, warm and alive in a way that seemed impossible. And just like that, it was done. Jake Morrison, high school dropout, divorced father, janitor, was now officially a member of one of the galaxy's most prestigious dragon clans. The celebration afterward was overwhelming. Dragons he'd never met came up to congratulate him. Other species wanted to shake his hand, take photos, ask questions. Dr. Foster pulled him aside to discuss publishing a paper about Ember. Tommy the cargo hauler, who'd refused to help smuggle Ember, sheepishly offered to buy him a drink. Through it all, Ember stayed glued to Jake's side, occasionally singing little bursts of dragon song that made everyone stop and listen. The little grey dragon was finally getting the attention he deserved, and he seemed both pleased and terrified by it. Later, when the crowds finally thinned, Kellen approached them. The ambassador moved slowly, almost hesitantly. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward Ember. Jake wanted to say no. The protective instinct was strong. But he saw something in Kellen's face, genuine regret, genuine desire to make amends. And Ember deserved to know his biological father, even if that relationship would never be simple. "Yeah," Jake said. "Go ahead." Kellen knelt down, making himself smaller. He extended a claw, and Ember sniffed it cautiously. The hatchling chirped once, a questioning sound. "I am sorry," Kellen said quietly, speaking directly to his son for the first time. "I looked at you and saw only my disappointment, not your potential. I failed you as a father. I do not ask forgiveness. I only ask the chance to do better." Ember considered this. Then, slowly, he stepped forward and bumped his head against Kellen's claw. Not quite trust, but maybe the beginning of it. Jake watched them, his chest tight with complicated emotions. This wasn't a fairy tale ending. Kellen hadn't magically become a perfect father, and the hurt of abandonment wouldn't disappear overnight. But it was a start. Over the following months, Jake's life transformed completely. He quit his janitorial job and became Ember's full-time guardian and student of Drathka culture. Kellen arranged for them to have proper quarters in the clan sector, actual rooms with high ceilings and space for Ember to practice flying. Jake studied the dragon language every day, slowly becoming fluent. He learned their history, their customs, their complex clan politics. It was harder than anything he'd done since high school, and there were days he wanted to quit. But Ember would curl up next to him while he studied, encouraging him with soft chirps and occasional bursts of song. More importantly, other Drathka started coming forward. A warrior named Thax showed up one day with a hatchling that had 3 legs instead of 4. A merchant brought a young dragon whose scales were white instead of the traditional colors. A scientist presented a hatchling that couldn't breathe fire but could somehow manipulate electromagnetic fields. All of them had been hidden, kept secret out of shame. But Ember's story had changed something. Suddenly, different wasn't just acceptable, it was valued. Jake found himself at the center of something bigger than he'd imagined. With Dr. Foster's help and Kellen's political support, they established a sanctuary on a small moon in a neighboring system. A place where dragons who didn't fit the traditional mold could grow up safe, could learn to use their unique abilities, could be celebrated rather than hidden. They called it Haven's Rest. Jake named it after his daughter, Melissa Haven Morrison, in a moment of hope that maybe someday she'd understand what he was doing out here. The sanctuary grew quickly. Within a year, they had 27 dragons, each one unique, each one previously considered defective. Jake hired staff from multiple species, trained them in dragon care, built facilities designed for different body types and abilities. It was exhausting, overwhelming work. But every time he watched Ember soar through Haven's artificial sky, leading a pack of imperfect dragons in formation, Jake knew it was worth it. The real surprise came on a Tuesday afternoon in the sanctuary's second year. Jake was in his office, buried in supply requisitions, when his comm device chimed with an incoming call. Unknown number, Earth origin. He almost didn't answer. But something made him tap the accept button. A young woman's face appeared on the screen. Mid-20s, with his eyes and her mother's cheekbones. She'd grown up so much since he'd last seen her. "Dad." Melissa's voice was uncertain. I saw a news story about you. About what you're doing with the dragons." Jake's throat closed up. He couldn't speak for a moment. "I'm sorry I stopped calling," she continued, words tumbling out fast. "Mom said things, and I believed them, and I was angry. But I saw you on the news, standing up to that ambassador, defending that little dragon, and I thought, that's my dad. That's who he really is." "Melissa," Jake managed. "I'm sorry too. For everything." "Can I visit?" she asked. "I'd like to meet Ember. And I'd like to know you again." Jake looked out his office window at the sanctuary. Ember was teaching a younger dragon how to navigate obstacle courses, patient and encouraging despite his own limitations. The little gray dragon had grown into something magnificent, not despite his differences, but because of them. "Yeah," Jake said, smiling through tears. "Yeah, kiddo. Come visit. There's someone I really want you to meet." 3 weeks later, Jake stood at the sanctuary's landing pad, watching a shuttle descend. Ember perched on the railing beside him, curious about this human his father kept talking about. The shuttle door opened, and Melissa stepped out, older but still recognizably his daughter. She stopped when she saw him, just staring for a moment. Then she was running, and Jake was running, and they met in the middle in a hug that felt like coming home. "I missed you, Dad," she sobbed into his shoulder. "Missed you too, sweetheart. Every damn day." Ember chirped impatiently, and they broke apart laughing. Melissa knelt down, looking at the dragon with wonder. "So you're Ember," she said softly. "The dragon who saved my dad." Ember cocked his head, confused. Then he looked at Jake and sang a short, joyful melody. Jake understood now what it meant: family. "Actually," Jake said, pulling his daughter close with one arm while scratching behind Ember's horns with the other hand, "I think we saved each other." Years later, people would ask Jake about that night in the waste disposal area, about the decision to save one small dragon. They'd call him brave, heroic, visionary. He'd always shake his head at that. "I was just a janitor who saw something thrown away and thought it deserved better," he'd say. "Turns out, we all deserve better. We're all a little broken. We're all a little different. And that's not something to hide. That's something to celebrate." Ember, grown now to full size but still gray as storm clouds, still flying with one crooked wing, would usually add his own commentary, a burst of dragon song that needed no translation. It meant hope. It meant belonging. It meant that sometimes the most important families are the ones we choose, built not from blood alone but from love, from sacrifice, from refusing to give up on each other even when the whole galaxy says you should. And in the end, that's the only kind of family that really matters.